right, well, with no further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started? We're really glad to be here today from the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies and from Campus Compact for Wisconsin. Calvin Alfaro is with us from Campus Compact for Wisconsin, and the rest of us represent the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies. The topic of our discussion today is strengths, needs, challenges, and opportunities of the third sector in COVID-19. And we're really just excited and grateful to Eric and Brandy and the other organizers of the summit. Excuse me, I don't know why that keeps flipping. Got a sensitivity in my, there we go. We're really grateful to Eric and Brandy for hosting us today and for putting on this event. This is a really wonderful and incredible effort, actually, that has come together in such a short amount of time and is in and of itself an example of the type of work that many of our third sector change agents are doing in this urgent moment. So thanks so much for the excellence and rapid response that went into creating this online summit. I'm going to go ahead and let our panelists, or participants, I guess might be the better way to describe us, introduce themselves. We are still waiting for one of our student presenters who will be joining us very soon. My name is Mary Beth Collins, and I'm the Executive Director of the UW-Madison Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies. My background is as a practitioner in the field of nonprofit organizations, both as an attorney and service provider to those organizations, and also as a former executive director of a nonprofit organization. And then I've worn a lot of different hats with different nonprofits over the years and worked with many different types. And now I have the pleasure of working at the University of Wisconsin to direct our center and also help develop and deliver coursework and educational opportunities for those that want to be change agents in this field. And if the rest of you then could go in order and introduce yourselves and a little bit about your background, that would be great.
All right, I'm Amy Hilgendorf, and I'm the Associate Director at the UW-Madison Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies. My background is in applied research, community-based research, and evaluation. And with that experience, the bulk of my work is working with nonprofits and various government groups to do applied research projects and evaluation of their work. So I have opportunity to work with a lot of different organizations, working on a lot of different things, and I'll be speaking from that experience about what I'm observing with those groups today.
And this is Calvin Alfaro. I'm the director of Campus Compact for Wisconsin. Campus Compact is a association group that supports colleges and universities throughout the nation. And my role is to support colleges and universities in the state of Wisconsin. And what we do is we support the community-based learning that happens in many institutions with students working with nonprofit organizations. My previous background was as a philanthropist. I worked for a community foundation for about 10 years. Another hat that I wear is that I'm also a consultant for nonprofit organizations, looking at capacity building, nonprofit issues, technology issues, and board development.
Damon, do you want to say a little something about yourself?
So my name is Damon Taro. Worked in Madison for a number of years as we'll call it a change agent of sorts, but decided to go back and finish my undergraduate degree about 2 years ago in the community and nonprofit studies major. So just going to be speaking from experience as somebody that has done a lot of work with organizations in town, nonprofits and cooperatives mostly, but then also as like a student and from the perspective of somebody that is looking to get back into the field.
Thanks, we're so glad you're here. And Tara, has she joined yet? I can't see the participants while the screen is on my slides.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi Tara, welcome.
Hi, my name is Tara Stangler. Sorry, my cat will not cooperate with me right now. But kind of like Damon, I'm a student in the Community and Nonprofit Studies major at the University of Wisconsin. I also work for the Mortgage Center for Public Service as a community-based learning intern. So I work a lot with community partners around Madison as well as students at the university to ensure that the relationships between the two are continuously mutually beneficial. And aside from that, have worked at a number of nonprofits around Madison and am currently in the job market for things like that. So I'm constantly watching how things are changing in the third sector as of right now.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone. It's really fun to have pulled this together with all of you, and I'm excited about our discussion today. So I have to keep trying to figure out how to advance my slides. There we go. So just a little perspective on where we're coming from the UW-Madison Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies. We know that many of the folks that might tap into this webinar will not have had a lot of exposure to our center. Many of you are probably out in the community working on the front lines or in particular services that support community members. And if you're not on campus right at this moment, you may not be that familiar with the way that campus-based centers work. So we just wanted to provide a little bit of information on that to illuminate, where are we coming from here? So this graph that you see here on your screen is pretty complicated and the text is very small, and we totally appreciate that. But the purpose of it is just for me to be able to share that there are various centers on the University of Wisconsin campus. They're often affiliated with a school or college, and as such, ours is affiliated with the School of Human Ecology. And we do work to support departmental activities, including the major program that Damon and Tara are a part of, as well as graduate education. And then we also do work on research and outreach. And what we really try to do more than anything is bring all of that together. So as we collaborate with community organizations in the field, on the front lines, doing the work, we try to make sure that if we're doing research, that we're doing that as collaboratively as possible with their wisdom at hand. And we also try to make sure that our educational programming that we offer to students to prepare them for their work in the future is informed by the wisdom of what's going on out there in the field. And that is all part of kind of what we call inquiry and action for social change. It's part of the Wisconsin idea, and it's a work in progress. It's always a challenge and a pleasure to try to advance that kind of work from a major institution like UW. And if you haven't connected with us before, at the end of this presentation, we will give you some suggestions for ways to connect. So today, the goal of this discussion is really to kind of review some of the key issues that we've been able to see emerge in the way that COVID-19 has affected nonprofit sector and community efforts. And of course, we're only in the very early stages of that experience, but there certainly are themes that have emerged. So we're going to kind of go through a nice overview of those, just allowing everybody to step back from the work that they're doing and think about some of the bigger picture themes. And then we're going to consider ways that we can all use some of the lessons that we've already learned to possibly push forward some positive change in the future, whether that be kind of immediately or whether that be for the long game. And I did want to make a small note about terminology. I personally tend to use the word third sector quite a bit when I'm talking about nonprofit and community efforts. And the reason why I do that is because third sector, especially in a global context of looking at sectors in the world, is something that is usually used to define things that are not squarely government or public sector and are not squarely business or market based. So all of that richness in between, where people are doing work that's mission driven, that is not driven by profit, and that is not necessarily happening with the authority of the state behind it. So voluntary, grassroots, or nonprofit or community organization type efforts. We can think of it in terms of the nonprofit sector if that's more comfortable for others in the discussion today. But third sector feels a little broader to me because sometimes the work that we see being done, and this is absolutely the case in COVID-19 era activities, is being done by organizations or groups that are not necessarily formal nonprofit organizations, but in my mind and the mind of many others are still part of the sector that we're talking about. So that's just a note on terminology for today. So now getting into some of the themes that we said that we would look at. The very first one that I wanted to address and have our participants reflect on is just how we've seen such a rapid response, so much innovation, and so much support for the most urgent situations and the most vulnerable folks in this moment from the third sector. So I just have been wowed by everything I've seen over the last month in terms of organizations, community groups, nonprofits, social innovators, figuring out solutions basically as soon as the situation became apparent. So I'm going to not talk too much about this. I've got my favorite examples, but I really want to turn it over to my colleagues here and see if they can each share a couple of the examples that they've seen where the sector actors really stepped up in immediate and innovative ways, and what about those efforts maybe fit some of the characteristics that I've included here on the slide. So why don't we just go in order of Amy, Kelvin, Damon, and Tara, and just each of you volunteer kind of some of your favorite examples and why.
Yeah, so I think a general thing that I've been seeing is, especially right at first when things started closing down, the schools closed, and a lot of the organizations that I'm engaged with are thinking about serving families and kids and parents. And I think across the board, what I've seen is people getting very real about what is at the heart of their work, and that's people. The people that they're seeking to support, and what do those people need, and making sure that basic needs are there, but also sustaining relationships. So whether it's, community centers or childcare centers, I saw a lot of organizations think about our strength is our connection to the people that we're working with, that we're supporting. How do we maintain that, and how do we leverage that to make sure people have food, can access rent assistance, utility assistance, all of those kinds of things. And it's surprising to me how quickly and innovatively folks did that. I personally never thought about childcare workers doing Zoom calls, and that's what they were doing. That's really a valuable way to kind of achieve their mission. So I see people really coming back to the core of that and being very innovative in doing that. But it also includes going back to, what are other ways that we sustain relationships, which includes, writing letters, sending letters. So that's just been one observation. And that all happened very quickly too. Within a week or two, I didn't see many organizations just pause and say, what do we do now? It was boom, here's what we do. Here's how we continue to meet our mission.
I want to echo Amy's comment about the speed at which the nonprofit sector, the third sector, came together to weave together a sort of social safety net for those that are most disadvantaged in our community. As a society, we're lacking many of those things, and they quickly, have created the infrastructure to be able to secure additional funding from funders, to be able to gather the resources, and to continue to do the work even with all of this social distancing. And other players in higher education, I want to comment on the fact that so many groups that are not necessarily the third sector, but maybe in higher education, have come out with virtual volunteer and tutoring programs for the community, right? So I know many institutions in Wisconsin who are doing tutoring programs for where college students are tutoring K-12 students in their communities. And so it's been just a remarkable coming together and putting people at the center and sort of supporting each other. And I think one of the things that I take away from all of this is the importance of the inequalities that have been highlighted because of COVID-19, and making sure that as we transition into whatever normal will look like in the future, that we maintain that sense of those inequalities, and we work to continue to address them in a way that will allow us to be more prepared for the future.
Thank you. Can Can I be heard right now? Earlier, my mic was not working very well.
I can hear you, Damon.
Okay. So I suppose I would highlight the compassion with which the sector has moved over the speed, just in that, taking, for example, the university that I'm attending, right? Some of the worst examples of how to adapt have definitely been observed, but also a shout out to like Michael McGuire, who's one of our favorite professors in the program. This dude not only thought really intentionally about how to rebuild his lectures to be online, how to use the tools available to him, rather than just like create a digital facsimile of class, try to make an online experience that is worthwhile and different from what he would have done in the real world. But even beyond that, I think he's really done a good job, as he always does, of showing care for his students. So thinking about the fact that we are all dealing with a pandemic as we try to shift to online schooling. So maybe the standards should be different. Maybe the assignments should be different. Maybe just an occasional email like, hey, you all have this. It's going to be fine. Normal isn't great anyway, and we're going to do better moving forward. I'm excited to see what you all do as a result of this challenge. Those kind of messaging help you pull out of the hole of like, what do I do? Especially when your whole purpose in life is meeting people, connecting people, touching, being with humans. So I think that's been really impactful, and I've seen some similar efforts I do a lot of work with where cooperatives and nonprofits overlap. So like housing cooperatives right now are doing a lot of like forgiveness on rent and that kind of thing. That's been really moving as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so to kind of go off of what Damon just said, have had some really incredible and compassionate professors that really care about the students as people and recognize that we are people before we are students, and have just had some really incredible experiences with that. As someone who works at the Mortgage Center in a position that kind of works as like a community liaison with us and nonprofits in the area, I have seen the way in which nonprofits are, especially community centers like Goodman, Lucier, Freedom Inc., things of that nature, the way that they're trying to ensure that their community stays supported, whether that means things like food drives that are very volunteer driven, things where it's just, you know, how do we consistently check in with students when we can't see them all the time? How do we ensure that the community that we're serving remains in this position of feeling like they're well supported? And it's been really incredible to get to be on that other side of like, how do these relationships still maintain then with the university? What can we as students at the university as a whole do to ensure that like the people in the community in which we temporarily exist, so to speak, as students that come and go, how can we ensure that they're being sort of uplifted in that sense? And the Mortgage Center has done some great outreach work to try and make sure that, you know, good, correct information is being spread about the current pandemic and how things are developing, and creating networks within to try and keep everybody in the same loop and everybody on the same page, and consistently making sure that like everyone is going to be okay in the end. And I think that that aspect of like compassion and then the creativity in which they're doing it has been one of like the most incredible things that I think I've seen come out of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts. I have had the advantage of being able to kind of participate in some big picture discussions locally, nationally, globally, from different university and association-based convenings around what's happening in the philanthropic or third sector during this time. And I just continue to see, not from everything that's happening from Madison to Wisconsin, all the way to, again, global efforts, just that so many of these organizations were already geared towards the notion of fulfilling the greatest needs and the mission in the way that Amy referred to, so that maybe in a normal circumstance, the way that we're really here to serve people can get a bit diluted. In the moment that the need is so great, these organizations kicked into action. And I think what is really compelling about it, and that we need to take forward, and we'll get into this later when we talk about lessons learned, is that there was a moment there when everybody could see that the world was going to change and life was going to change and people were going to be separated from their resources and their normal lives. in a really intense way when no government aid had really kicked in. No guidance for how to get things done had really kicked in from any other sector. And in that moment, when people were immediately in need of support, these organizations are the ones that really filled that gap. And I think that's a reflection also on the way that the nonprofit and third sector has actually been operating in our society before that. It just wasn't as apparent in such a moment. We have basically, in many cases, decided that those that can't otherwise get help, or those that our policies don't otherwise protect, will be bailed out by these organizations. And I think that this is a moment of a reveal of that reality. I also think that some of the collaborations that have really been brewing and building across sectors and across organizations in the last couple of decades of nonprofit work have really kicked in for these organizations to do amazing things. In a lot of the discussions that I've been a part of, including the one focused on Makers Unite, where there's a graphic there about that, that was a Baltimore-based project where several different organizations, ranging from a makerspace to a group of artists, to a group of activists, to volunteers in the community, were all able to coalesce because of their existing relationships to do one of the fastest and most professionally designed and conducted mask making and face shield making efforts, and distribute those masks and face shields at cost to major healthcare institutions. And they talked in their discussion of that effort about the way that their relationship building over the years had allowed them to do that. So I think that it's been an impressive moment for the sector, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how that has happened even as the sector itself is taking hits because of the same issues that are facing families, individuals, businesses, and communities. And if I could advance my slide, that would be great. Okay. So this is the second key issue that we're going to talk about, the notion of the disruption of operations, programming, and the threats to sustainability of organizations. So even in this moment where the third sector kicked in such a rapid and robust way, these organizations themselves are taking major hits because of COVID-19 and the ripple effects of this pandemic crisis. As many of you on the call know, if you had a major fundraising event planned in April or May of 2020, that revenue is basically probably off the table for your nonprofit organization. Organizations that have revenue-based programming, like after-school programs or camps, are not going to get that revenue in the near future. And obviously those organizations that want to do in-person programming usually are now having to figure out ways to make extreme adjustments to do that, including to meet fundamental needs like distribute food from a food pantry. And there's also a need, as Amy indicated in her comments, and Kelvin, for some organizations to just change their actual activities to fulfill their mission now that the circumstances surrounding their communities and constituents has changed so dramatically. So maybe before you were trying to build empowerment among moms in a neighborhood, and now instead of hosting circles or discussions about that, you might just be figuring out how to support them in getting a hotspot for their kids to go to school virtually or getting them food delivery. So with that, I'd like to turn it to Amy first, and then the others, about what kinds of adjustments have we been seeing nonprofit organizations make, and how are they kind of working through that, either with regard to the loss of something or with the need to actually pivot affirmatively towards a change in their programming. And Amy brings a lot of wisdom to this because she, as the associate director of our center, leads our Co-Create initiative, which works directly with community and nonprofit organizations on projects and technical support. So I know she's probably got some great examples for us.
Yeah, I think the thing I'll speak to most is how I've seen organizations dealing with the fundraising situation right now. In particular, I see a lot of organizations trying to quickly write for grant opportunities, which are coming up in response to COVID-19, which is, a fantastic move to see philanthropists opening up funds and often in more unrestricted ways than we've seen before, which is great. However, this is all happening at times when these organizations are dealing with multiple challenges and really trying to, as we talked about, meet the needs of those they work with most closely. And so extremely strained in their time, their energy, and yet there's a funding opportunity. Mm-hmm. And still a lot of challenges in crafting a project and writing for that and competing with others. And real concerns on top of all of that about loss of fundraising from events and programs, et cetera. So I think it's putting organizations in a really, really tough spot where there's no good choice. I think many organizations feel like they have to go for these opportunities right now. Otherwise, their organization is not going to survive this time. And that is, that's a very real concern. It's a concern I have too. I know, many of the organizations that I think are some of the most important ones in our community, and really trying to do innovative things that supports people who are most marginalized by our current systems. They may be smaller, they may be newer, and they may not have as easy of a marketing pitch that gets the donors to their door. So they have to apply for these things, or we might see a real contracting in what organizations may get out of this. So it's a very tough time for keeping doors open and making sure that organizations are going to be able to make it out of this okay, and especially being able to have the funds to do anything else than meet basic needs.
Great. I just invite the other participants to share their thoughts on this topic.
I would just highlight one thing is that many, in alignment with Amy's comments, many of these nonprofits have no financial reserves, and those that have some sort of financial reserve have probably depleted it already. So yeah, they're in very dire straits. Not to mention that these are also workers who have their own families, who are now being teachers for their children, who are caregivers for their elderly parents that may live with them. Mm-hmm. And so they're dealing with the same issues that we are all dealing with, and at the same time serving as essential workers to provide that safety net for our community members. So it's a very difficult place for nonprofits at this time.
Mm-hmm. And the one hopeful note I might add on that, though it doesn't start out that way, is that it is also a very rough time for the private and even public sectors. When we think about it, we can say that COVID-19 put us in this situation, but realistically, it's the fact that we have a coercive economy that is predatory at its very core. So when our entire system is built around the idea that people shouldn't have the ability to make free choice because the best thing for them is to be pressured into continually always producing, like it's unsustainable, it's untenable. We know that. We have for a long time. That's the core of a lot of our work. And so now that the entirety of what we do has to be re-envisioned, I think we can also re-envision this third sector, because I think one of the things we don't want to say unconsciously, but maybe without a lot of alternative choices have appropriated from business culture is this idea that we need to be stringing along month to month, paying rent to somebody who has no intention of helping our people thrive, and kind of doing this very thinly strung out programming. And that's a result of the fact that we don't have access resources. But maybe as we continue to re-envision what the private sector looks like, and maybe collide some of this work, having more of that be mission driven and more of our work be able to produce money, I mean, that type of thing could also be fertile ground for improvement of the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these challenges do get at some of the fundamental assumptions that the sectors have been operating under for a long time, which I think many of us knew were flawed to begin with. Tara, do you have anything to add to this key issue?
Not much that hasn't already been said. I think Damon kind of just touched on things that I would have mentioned, but also just mentioning when you notice nonprofits in your area having these sort of struggles, if you have the ability to just make sure that you continue to support them in whatever capacity that you can. Um, Whether that's, offering your time as a volunteer, offering some sort of monetary donation or donations for things in their programs that they're trying to continuously support, whether that means like pantry donations. I'm not really sure what is allowed to be donated during this time. It might vary based on center to center or place to place, but just making sure that in whatever capacity we all understand that this is a very difficult time for everybody, and trying to help and make sure that we share that compassion with everybody as we're moving forward.
Absolutely. So on the topic of resources, I think several of us on the call, on the webinar today, have had the opportunity to hear quite a bit actually from the sort of funder and philanthropic donor side of things, both Wisconsin-wide and globally. And there are a few key themes that are popping up in that particular context. So these are going to be comments about the organizations that historically fund the Frontlines organizations. And what we're hearing, I'll just kind of quickly go through the main points, and then I'm going to invite you all to chime in, starting with Kelvin, and then moving on from there. So a lot of emergency funding has been made available, and everyone here probably has seen the signs of that. I would actually kind of characterize that as really seeing a sense of responsibility on the part of the private foundations and funders almost immediately, which I was really encouraged by. Nobody in those organizations has to necessarily make additional funds available, but many private foundations, family foundations, corporate foundations, and individual donors step forward almost immediately, almost as immediately as those Frontlines organizations kicked in. We saw the donors do something similar. The other thing we've been hearing is that many funders are trying to remain very flexible and authentic with their Frontlines organizations, and are encouraging them to be real about their financially precarious situations. So we know over time that the power dynamic between funders and Frontlines organizations would often prevent a Frontlines organization or a funded organization from talking about financial instability with their funder or other challenges that their organization may face, with the idea that that might prevent them from being as robustly funded. But we're hearing now that in this situation, everyone knows all stability is off the table. And so there are actually some honest conversations happening, and funders are saying, even if we give you a grant for this program, feel free to use it for other things. I think that the last 3 points I'll kind of open up to everybody, but basically looking at, Kelvin mentioned this before, but are we going to reckon with the fact that the way that nonprofit organizations have been funded has always been very thin and precarious? Very few organizations have a lot of reserves, and we still rely on those organizations to be there to fill the gaps. And so what does that mean? Should we be thinking about more operational and stable support for these organizations? And then I'm just hearing a lot about the multi-sector collaboration possibilities here. And then I think there's a looming concern that these funders are also going to be facing the skids in a certain way because of endowment declines with the stock market plummeting. Although what I'm hearing so far is the optimistic view that, well, we learned a lot of lessons about that in 2008. But I think the gravity and scale of what we're facing now is different. So with that, I'll ask Kelvin to chime in, and then anybody else that has thoughts or reflections on this theme.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, so as you mentioned, there's a lot of funders who are doing emergency response funds, and they're being very flexible. There are some funders, though, that are going above what I would consider above and beyond, and dipping into their endowments to provide an extra year of funding, or converting all their project grants to general operating support, and accelerating payments to grants that they already have. So I think there's some that are doing some really good work beyond what others are doing. So it's worth celebrating that these funders are stepping up in this critical time. And one thing I do want to mention is that there is the leading authority of philanthropy in the US, the Council of Foundations, has put out a call to action for foundations throughout the United States to take a pledge. And that pledge includes things like to loosen or eliminate the restrictions on current grants, make new grants as unrestricted as possible, reduce the workload that they ask of grantees, such as report writing, contribute to community-based emergency response funds, communicate proactively and regularly with grantees, commit to listening to what the grantees are learning and what they're experiencing on the ground, support as appropriate grantee partners advocating for important public policy change. And I think this was really important, and it highlights sort of the theme of the conversation we've been having, that the nonprofit sector is the safety net of our society that, doesn't really have the resources to really be the proper safety net that I think many Americans need. And then the last action that they're asking them to take is to learn from those lessons that they're learning right now and share them with other philanthropists. And the good thing about all this is that to date, about 700 foundations throughout the United States have taken that pledge and are committing to doing that kind of thing.
It's a fantastic detail. What do the others have to say about this theme?
I can add in that, yeah, I think some, positive patterns that we've seen that I would like to see continue are certainly that opening up of more funding for operations. Every time I talk to organizations about their challenges with fundraising, that's the number one thing that comes up is they want, operating funds, and it's usually not possible. But second, funders really talking to their grantees about what's your experience, how can I help you? That's a really positive move. I do have a couple of concerns about what the long-term implications might be, though. As I mentioned before, I'm concerned that the most established nonprofit organizations that also fall most in line with, traditional nonprofit sector right now, how we see the world as it is, not as it should be, are going to survive this better than others, in part because of the fundraising game and how relationships are a part of that, et cetera. I'm also a little concerned that there's going to be a reverting to as things are now, and less willingness to be challenged and to move into new spaces. To think about basic needs, which we are funding right now, in food, medical care, et cetera, easy, right? That's all very easy. Seeing the value of community organizing might be a little bit more challenging right now, and I'm worried about long term as well. So that's, and any focus on systems work, I think could be a little bit more challenging for funders to see the value of as we move forward. We'll see.
Yeah. There's some interesting activities happening in the arts nonprofit sector in kind of spinning how that type of activity in our communities still really needs to be supported, even though it would be an easy one to leave aside while we're looking at kind of basic needs concerns right now, which I thought was really smart on the part of those organizations to start building up that narrative sooner rather than later. I also think that your point, Amy, about large organizations possibly coming out of this a lot better, that has been the pattern, I would say, for recent memory in the nonprofit sector. And I was hopeful that that was changing towards putting some faith in those grassroots organizations closest to the ground. But I think that what we saw happen with the first wave of the CARES Act, hopefully not the second, and the PPP funding that was available to nonprofit organizations absolutely played out that way. Large organizations that had relationships with banks and had the resources to be able to efficiently apply for those funds were much more likely to get it than organizations that did not have those kinds of capital at their fingertips. What do others think about this one before we move on? Any further comments?
Just a couple. I think it might be an important moment to really interrogate the notion of perpetuity as like an inherent goal in all that we do.
Yeah.
I've seen some really, really powerful speakers talk about how organizations that are not afraid to face their own death can do so much better work. And as a Black man, that's kind of always been part of what I've been like if you're successful, they kill you. metaphorically, physically, in some way, they'll come for you. So like the notion that what you do is supposed to last forever, I think, is another one of those values we kind of appropriated from business culture that doesn't always make sense. There's the notion of fiduciary responsibility, but there's also the idea that like after a forest fire, right, some really important growth can happen, and not just funding as far as resources, but there are a lot of people right now that just took a month, are going to have a whole nother month probably to sit around and think about, do I want to go back to work? Do I want to face my boss who is extracting my labor every day, or do I want to do something meaningful? Like, what if I would have died in the last month? Would I have been happy with what I was doing with my life? And I think out of that, we're going to see a profusion of new organizations, of new interest in our old organizations. And if we're willing to do organizing at a level that doesn't require as much funding, where we just it is more volunteer and it is more crowdsourced, we might still see some solid work done, even if it's not in the same mold we're used to. Even if I used to say my first organization, ASO, if we need to create the OSA tomorrow, we'll do it. It's a tool. It's a set of letters. It's something that we use to achieve our mission. It is not our mission. And if we don't confuse those things, as painful as it is, and it does have real implications in people's lives as far as what they can put on their table for their family, I think the people doing the food is still growing. So we can still recover even if the funding thing has to be figured out. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. But I'm also not huge on the funding side of things, other than where it intersects with the other sectors.
Yeah, I think there's a very small but vocal contingency of family foundation, like younger generation inheritors or managers of family foundations that have actually taken the position that they're going to just blow their endowment on the immediate needs, because even pre-COVID-19, looking at things like not blow it, but spend it. It's not, I didn't mean that to be a misuse term, but just spend it all in one swoop, looking at existential crises that they are concerned about, like climate change and now COVID. There's a small but mighty and vocal group of people saying, what are we holding on to this endowment for? I mean, if there's no there in 25 years, what good is the money lasting? So your point about perpetuity, although I think it was a little bit more focused on other types of activities, I think also very much applies to the funder side too.
And one of the juxtapositions I really like for that is if you think about the prepositions afterwards, there's a difference between saving for something and keeping from something. And I think as people shift to like saving your money for a different day where you intend to use it is one thing. Sitting on a stockpile that is never actually going to help the community is an entirely different one. And so it's exciting to hear that that's a conversation.
Great. So another thing we know is a really big challenge, and it kind of goes along with some of the things we've already talked about. So maybe we won't spend quite as much time here. But it's the notion that these organizations that are doing this work and have been so nimble, they still have their general operations to worry about in this moment. They have boards of directors, they have staff, they have programming they're still trying to do. And there are all these concerns and adjustments and things that are kicking in a way that nobody could really have ever predicted in this realm of operations and best practices. And so I think all of you on the call have great perspective on this. So I'm just going to see, kind of looking at the slide information, what you'd like to share about this point. I know Kelvin and I have presented on it recently, so maybe I'll have him get us started.
Sure. So especially now, it's important to keep your board members engaged in different capacities. And so say, for example, a couple of examples we used before is conducting virtual meetings with them and doing things that you would normally do face-to-face, like a board orientation, orienting someone via Zoom, or having two different board members meet together so that they can share and get to know each other. Even prospective board members could be vetted via Zoom. The other thing is just having regular check-ins with your board that are not necessarily board meetings, but having like a virtual coffee hour with folks so that you can check in with them as people and then also as board members for your organization. I'll let somebody else contribute. Any other thoughts to that?
Amy, I know in Co-Create you may be seeing some needs with regard to even the good challenge of the infusion of new funds, and perhaps things related to communication. I know we're hearing a lot of frontlines organizations saying, wow, we have communications needs we didn't really know we had before. Any thoughts on those topics?
Yeah, I think, one thing that people are at least thinking about more, what it looks like, what's possible is different for many, but social media communication and things like that, and how those things, they're beyond just communication now. It's also ways to keep connection with community members, and to keep connections with donors, and to help influence the broader narrative about what the nonprofit sector is doing, or what particular organizations are doing, or why meeting basic needs right now is important for being able to do this other type of organizing and empowerment work, or changing systems. What it looks like for each organization as they do this, what they can do at this moment looks very different. But I think communications is being kind of understood, and its connections in all sorts of different levels. I also think that a lot of organizations that I'm working with are developing new understanding for how they're interconnected with other organizations and other sectors, and the need for strong relationships and communication across those is really influential too. I hear this most from organizations that work with youth, understanding that yes, school partners were important before, but considering how quickly and significantly everything has changed around schooling has amplified the need for good communication with particular parts as well.
Yeah. So Tara, I know you have a good lens on some kind of frontlines activities through your past engagement with community centers and now at the Mortgage Center. Do you have any observations on any of these topics on the slide? But I'm particularly curious about the way that many organizations have had to figure out their own protocols for some of their activities and keeping people safe, just pretty much on their own with their best guess, or not guess, but their best educated, surmising of the information that's out there, what to do. Do you have any great observations or stories from the field about that from your work at Mortgage and with community organizations?
Yeah, I've got some. So with the Mortgage Center, we're kind of doing I'm part of like a other subgroup that's just focused on what to do in the COVID crisis in terms of like how we spread information, one, to the community and amongst ourselves as nonprofits within the Madison area. So there's been a lot of effort to like get people, I don't know if anyone's familiar with like the Manitowoc Minute or something of that sort. It's some sort of popular Facebook page. We were able to get him to like do a video and spread the word about like how to stay safe during COVID, what the proper procedures should be. So it's been really interesting to see how it also in the age of this like social media like influencer sort of thing, how much power that holds, and how the efforts have shifted maybe from like us reaching out specifically only to doctors and specialists in the field, but reaching out to people that have this wide sort of social gathering space where we can spread the most information. And then it's been really interesting too to work with places like Freedom Inc. and whatnot in a classroom setting of like, what do we do now with the students, both at the community center and in the classroom at the university, of like how we're supposed to do this. So it's been the virtual meeting aspect has been sort of an up and down, and in terms of engagement, that's been something that's been really difficult. Is there's so much constant and consistent pressure on people during this time to get stuff done, but where do we draw that line of I am at home right now. I am working from home, but I am not at work. And understanding that sort of like difficult thing, even for students. Like, I know that that's been something that I've really struggled with, is like, when can I turn it off? When do I stop? And that's been something that the Mortgage Center has been pushing out to student interns, is always remembering that you're a person first, then you're a student, then you're an employee. So I'm really thankful for how they've been handling this, but I know that that isn't necessarily the case for everyone. So just encouraging people to remember that while there are all these like deadlines and everything is changing at such a rapid pace, you can't help people unless you're helping yourself, because you're going to hit that point of just absolute burnout. I know Zoom burnout's been like something that's been going around a lot. So just thinking about like, in time of crises, how do we communicate when we need help and assistance, and how do we set those boundaries? And I think that some places around Madison are definitely doing a really great job of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think, pre-COVID-19, we knew that nonprofit organizations were often, kind of in quicksand all the time with getting things like best practices and policies and procedures and best board practices and communications plans in place. Well, now those are the organizations we're relying on for very heavy duty frontlines activities because of our reliance on the sector. And on top of all of those other operational things that were already a struggle, now they're having to devise, their technique for distributing food safely. And there's not necessarily like a dominant resource that they can turn to give them a clear path for that. And I just think it's very interesting how, once again, in their creativity and commitment, many of them are doing the best they can, but it's an additional burden in this challenging situation. And I think that's going to also be really interesting when things start opening again, is how are these organizations, without necessarily having an edict from a particular government agency about how to do it, how are they going to figure out the best way to do that? So to be continued on this one. So before we move on to the next slide, I just want to double check that everybody on the panel can stay a little bit past our originally proposed approximate end time of 3 o'clock. I think if we could go a little bit past 3, that would be good. How do you guys feel about that? Is that going to work for you?
Yeah, sounds good.
I have a few more minutes. I could probably stay 3:10 at the latest.
Perfect. Okay, let's go for 3:10. And if anybody has different feedback in the chat that you need to share with me, let me know, because I can't see the chat. Okay, great. So this one I think we'll just not spend a ton of time on, but I think it was an important point to raise. The picture you see there, that like slide that's been inserted in the slide, is basically just an overview slide on some types of advocacy that we see nonprofit organizations doing to get at some things that they know best need to be addressed in society. Many nonprofit organizations for a long time have been intimately familiar with the way that there are root causes and infrastructural gaps in society that they can't possibly, in their day-to-day mission-based work, overcome, even though they're trying to help make the situation better for people. And so organizations for a long time have been trying to figure out the best ways to use that voice and that knowledge to advocate for change. And so we've been working at the center with organizations on that topic for some time, but now in COVID-19, we know that there are huge challenges to that activity, even as those frontlines organizations may have the best knowledge of what's actually going on in communities. They're serving the communities most closely. They would know what their needs are that need to be advocated for with decision makers and policy, and now their methods are hit by the need to be socially isolated. And I know Damon has some thoughts and reflections on this, so I'm going to invite him to just share a little bit about that.
Sorry. So I guess advocacy, like everything else, is going to have to change. And advocacy being different than lobbying, right? Like lobbying, where we're talking on behalf of people to the folks that have power over them. How do you empower people to speak up for themselves when they're isolated, when they can't feel they can't have somebody there to remind them to take a deep breath, to like hold their hand physically. So that's going to have to change. And I think we're also going to have to deal with just the bitterness of the I told you so, like these folks that now want to say we're all interconnected and you owe it to us to stay at home, but also to pay us rent. I mean, I'm also incredibly concerned about the way we're talking about the protesters that are rallying right now at the Capitol. A lot of times I mean, I've been a protester, and they always denigrate why you're there. They always denigrate how they always talk about how you're being selfish, you're being reckless. And yes, we need to take very seriously the health concerns that this could bring for people, but we have to remind ourselves that we don't actually know how all of this works. And frankly speaking, there is a real and rational fear of a mandated quarantine, and that folks might feel like it's worth it to get together, but how we go about interacting with those people shows a lot about how we're going to need to move forward. I guess I'm just concerned that in this moment we need to be focusing on, again, like, I mean, I guess from my perspective, always re-envisioning the whole of the system as opposed to a couple of symptoms. But I guess that's all I really have on this one.
Great. Well, I want to make sure we get to talking a little bit about the next gen of leaders and change agents in the sector. And I'm going to have Tara kick us off on this one, but also encourage Damon to chime in. So I hope you guys don't mind, but I poached some pictures of you from the interwebs. And I just wanted to highlight that these are just two of our many amazing change agents that are just about to launch their career in the sector. They were already going to bring different talents and brilliance to the field. They have a completely different perspective from my ability to observe them. That's what I see. They have a completely different perspective on the sector in many cases, and now they face the challenge of launching their careers at this very strange time. So I just was wondering if you two could share a little bit about your cohort of graduating seniors, what you're thinking about and what you're planning for next steps, and what you're kind of seeing from that perspective in the sector.
Yeah, so as a cohort, we have one group in our capstone class that are all in the same boat of most of us are graduating. None of us have any idea. On top of the what do you do once you graduate university, what do you do once you have that like safety net of like, oh, I can plan out my classes for next year. Oh, I know that this will be a thing. And that now you're being thrust into this world of like an actual job market, and we have to start considering things and have talked to a lot of people about like what that's looked like, have known a lot of people that had these internships and jobs lined up where now there's no funding left to be able to support them. There's no ability for them to do the work that they were going to do. So there's talk of like pushing it back. And what does that mean in terms of like financial stability for people? What does it mean in terms of like, have a couple of friends that decided, well, now I guess I'm going to have to go to grad school because there's nothing else that I can do feasibly in this time that isn't just sitting at home. So it's been kind of this sense of almost impending dread for a lot of people. But I think in that I've been able to connect with a lot more people than I would have beforehand in terms of like, we're sharing resources, we're taking the time to like communicate more of like, how are we doing in this time, in this space? Like what resources are out there for us? What do we do in this sort of third sector job world where we know that in general we may not have made a lot of money, but now we don't know how any of our positions are going to be funded. So that's been something that's been extremely stressful, but it's also been very eye-opening in the sense of the people that are saying, I don't care about the money, I don't care about the stability, I want to continuously make change in the work that I'm doing. So how do I do that? What sort of resources are there for me? And it's been really great to have people, I'm really thankful to have someone like Mary Beth who's been able to like kind of assure me about what's going on and then also talk me through like what sort of things are going on. And I know that not everybody has that. So really being honest about your experience is something that needs to happen. But my path has gone about 30 different directions in the past week alone of what do I do now. And the best way that I would say that organizations can support us is let us know consistently, like connect with the university of like what resources are out there in terms of like remote work. What is it looking like for us to be able to make these big changes that we've spent, 4 years building and building and building, what do we do now? And I wish I had better answers for like where I see us going, but we've had to drastically adapt within the past just month or so of like everything keeps getting back and pushed back, and it feels like no one can give us a solid answer about it. So any sort of like actual answer as to what, just an honest answer of like, I don't know where this is going, is a lot better than being like, oh, well, we'll just push it back. So just that aspect of it has been a little frustrating.
And just to add on to that, I think Tara did a great job of talking about a lot of what they bring and our opportunities. I think as far as how to best support them, would really want to reiterate that humility and encouragement are always the best way. And this really highlights that, and that even those of us that are cursed with that Cassandra syndrome future vision, where you're always telling the truth and never believe like I know what's going to happen next week, you guys just need to trust me. None of us saw this coming. I mean, other than the fact that epidemics are cyclical, like the world is not guaranteed tomorrow. So when young people tend to speak from why they want to do things, they're mission driven people still, they haven't had it beaten out of them. And so oftentimes we encourage them instead to think of what will this net you? What will this gain you? But how many people were talked down to about the idea of quitting their job or trying something wild and new, even though right now there's $1,200 coming regardless of whether or not you're employed. So there's, and even if you kept your job, you might have lost it anyway through no fault of your own. Even if you were smart and had savings, it can be eaten up, gobbled up, destroyed. So rather than telling them to be pragmatic, I think what we need to do is tell them to be who they are and support that in whatever way we can. And also be really careful about not pretending that we know ahead of time what that's going to look like, what the best course of action for them is going to be. Maybe instead of telling them what to do, like asking them what they'd like to do and trying to help them find that.
Absolutely. Brilliant. We will all take this to heart and try to find ways to take your advice. Before Kelvin has to leave us, I want to turn to what are some of the lessons learned or silver linings that we might have seen during this, kind of like summing up here before we wrap up today. And I've put some things down there in the slides that we've picked up from our conversations over the last month or so with nonprofit organizations and folks in the field. But Kelvin, especially with you having to leave pretty soon, do you have any silver linings or lessons learned that are really rising to the top for you, whether they relate to what's on the slide or whether they're just your own observations?
I just think, Damon's point about encouraging young folks to be mission driven and pursue sort of the change that they want to see in the world is really important. And I think highlighting the role of the role of higher education in doing that, especially if higher education has a focus on reaching those that are marginalized and that don't traditionally have access to education. So just continuing to do sort of the work that UW-Madison and others are doing in the state of Wisconsin, which is really taking students into communities to experience in an authentic way, not in a sort of white savior sort of way, but in a way that really gets them to experience the challenges that that others may be facing, and invites and awakens this passion in them to be able to want to do something about it.
Great. Now, Amy, I know you've been involved in some of the conversations that led to these bullet points here. I wonder if you have any reflections to share about lessons learned and silver linings.
Well, I think one is that there might be, more appreciation for sure of what folks in the nonprofit sector are doing, as well as how incredibly innovative folks can be, quickly changing course, leveraging their assets to meet the needs that they see. I have infinite amounts of admiration for the things I've been hearing from organizations, and I think potentially kind of the sector as a whole, there might be that appreciation as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think also for many folks, whether they are connected to the nonprofit sector or otherwise, are gathering more appreciation for, what's important, health, family, being able to meet your basic needs, and realizing that beyond that, there's a whole lot that's not important. And maybe some of the wisdom from that can lead to some paradigm shifts, as we have suggested here. So I don't know what exactly that looks like, but sometimes that brings me a little bit of hope as well.
Sure. Tara and Damon, any lessons learned or silver linings that you have to share?
Or Tara?
Pardon?
Oh, I was gonna let Tara go first because I'm notorious for talking too much.
I can feel it. I think one thing, it's just kind of solidified for me at least that I definitely did pick the right major and the right career, because I'm consistently surrounded by people that are having these sort of conversations about what do we do next? How do we actually help instead of adding to a problem, or what do we do that's going to be sustainable for the time being until we can start working towards some of these like bigger issues, having conversations around like how people are in general, that like level of compassion for humanity that's coming out within the third sector has been very gratifying, in the sense that it's hard to like put into words, just like that feeling of like relief, where I'm not worried about what I'm going to be doing afterwards, because I know whatever it is, it's going to be helping someone in some way. That's been extremely comforting. And it's also been extremely comforting to know that like Madison as a whole is finding ways to handle these sort of situations in an inclusive manner, because as a person of color, there's a lot of times where situations like this might happen, and as an Asian American, there's a lot of blame that gets put on people like us for these sort of pandemics, and really seeing how the community has stepped up to ensure that I am supported, that we are supported, has been a really incredible response that I was really worried wasn't going to happen. But especially within Madison, having places like Freedom and all of these places that are supporting Asian American youth has been really, really, really incredible.
Beautiful.
I think two takeaways I'd like to bring up. First of all, now might be the time for us to go from being the third sector to the first. Just in that, I think a lot of people right now might be able to grasp that the colloquial definition of profit that we use about just like making money isn't what we're talking about. When we say nonprofit, we mean like profit as a legal entity is taking the labor of somebody else and keeping it. If it's your own labor, it's not profit, it's surplus. If you're just getting paid, that's not profit, that's wages. So how is it that we have normalized extortion to the point where that is the option? When we tell people that you got a dream of making cars, go into profitary business. Why not make your cars as a nonprofit? If you don't have that desire to steal other people's labor, don't do it. And I think this could be a really good moment to highlight that, and to start normalizing that you can make money in this field. And even if you're not driven by that, it's not a tertiary option. It's absolutely viable for you. And so I think that's going to be a lot of really important work going on. And then the most important takeaway for me personally has also been that like pain is not our enemy and control is not a real option. So it's not like we're going to overcome death, disease, famine, and pain. That like we are the type of people that work to ameliorate that, and we want to alleviate suffering as much as we can. But one way to do that is to deliver food to somebody that's hungry. One way to do that is to help somebody get better who's sick. But one way to do that is to just like be present, is to hear folks, is to care about them truly, and commiserate with them when there is pain that we can't foresee. Because even once this is over, there's going to be obstacles to living our best lives, and what we can do for each other is try to be supportive. So I think like when we get into these moments where the fear meter is so high and every possible messaging apparatus you have to interact with is telling you that death's around the corner and nothing is certain and everybody's hurting, that is one truth. We're seeing, like we've talked about, a lot of really important, impactful work. So keeping that in mind is our mission isn't completely eradicating pain, but making life more worthwhile wherever we find it. I think that's a good thing to keep under.
Those are some incredibly eloquent, philosophical, deep reflections. I appreciate them a lot. And I don't disagree. I think there's also been some kind of more immediate strategic things that I'll just quickly share about here. I mean, one thing we heard in a global call with some of our partners is how some communities are saying, you know, one good thing about this is that the earth is healing. Some of those pictures you see there are some of our collaborators and colleagues. One on the left is coastline restoration in Puerto Rico, and the one on the right is our colleague Maria Elena Humbachado, working with some of her indigenous food producer colleagues and collaborators. And these are examples of work that folks have been pushing for and doing for a long time that now can be seen in a pretty different light. And in the case of just the earth and its health, the isolation has actually created better conditions on that front. And I think people's understanding of why indigenous sustainable food systems might make sense is going to be seen with a lot more favorability than ever before. I think go ahead.
I saw a really, really good article, the coordination about that, where they were talking about a few months ago, the proposal to completely suspend air travel would have been asked and that people would have laughed at you. And yet here we are. So we're thinking about how much travel do we need? How is this potentially a huge shakeup that needs to be done? Because I mean, as high as the mortality rate is, and it's scary, the mortality rate for like Black children in America, like what about occupied countries? What about like all these places where we find death, but we're able to look away because it hits a particular population? If we care this much about preventing suffering and we can do these really massive shakeups, why don't we do that to solve some of these other issues? And I think that's a really encouraging, visceral one, is with the healing of the earth.
Right. Like by example of this experience, there are new openings for ways to address social change and social welfare, including the way that we suddenly found all of this money and in many cases, community centers to house the homeless. And the list goes on of sudden opportunities we've taken that were very difficult to find the will for prior to this moment. And I think that relates to our recognition that this situation really makes it clear how codependent we are. We can't have some of us sick and some of us be protected from that. Another thing we've heard is just that for some organizations, this quiet time might be a time to regroup on long game stuff. And that kind of relates to some of your comments about the paradigm shift. I also wonder, with the governmental responses that we're seeing and the lack of coordination on so many levels, if in many ways, to Damon's point about the third sector being the first sector, if the third sector really is going to carry the day on any kind of actually functional solution for this situation. Those are a few things that have come up in some of our recent discussions. And we need to wrap up here, but I do want to just see if anybody has any particular calls to action in this moment before we close. I think this conversation will need to continue over time, but one of the things we really value at the center is not only to, as the picture on the left indicates, inquire about things and discuss them, but as the picture on the right indicates, which is not us, but a community partner of ours that we really admire, taking action on food systems in their community, we also want to take action in addition to learning and inquiring about this stuff. So I'm just going to ask anybody that has a call to action or a next step in mind to just popcorn that out, and then we'll close it down for today.
One thing that just comes to mind off the top of the head is that if folks are looking for housing, either now or come August, when for some reason we all play musical apartments, cooperatives are going to be a good choice in that they are a lot more accommodating for a number of reasons, but they're going to be looking for people too, as a lot of folks move for various reasons. So keep your local cooperatives in mind.
Great. I know Amy may say something similar, but one thing we're really trying to do at the center is find ways to do technical support to help alleviate the burden of a lot of these nonprofits out there on the front lines. So we've been applying for some funds for that, and we really hope that we can serve some of these organizations by helping to tell their story to policymakers and decision makers and funders, and also to, again, just provide that basic support on how to make operations work, how to make policies come into place, how to make processes happen when these organizations we know are tapped on so many levels. Amy, do you have anything to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, two things that I think, sitting from where we are, I think two things that we can do that can support this being, a turning of a page into a better future is seeing this picture from Menachanakim in the Menominee Nation, lifting up examples of folks who are really, really doing things different and in a way that is anchored in a whole different way of seeing the world and the world as it can and should be, and lifting up those examples of what people are doing so that we can think differently and do differently. But then also I think, reminding funders of how they're operating differently now, and that can and probably should continue the lessons learned that they're seeing, and what reminding them about different possibilities to operate.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have some calls to action to add?
Would just say, because there is this idea that there could be a shift to some sort of indigenizing perspectives on how we grow and how we understand food. There are a lot of local native tribes, native associations in your area that are doing things to sell food and to teach these sort of things. So consistently supporting them and finding ways, whether it's funding, spreading the word, that is something that is a big part of my research as an undergraduate, is how do we help tribal nations return to this idea of like food sovereignty, and part of that is just allowing them to grow, produce in the way that they can, and then selling that. So finding ways that you can support your local tribes is really, really, really important, especially during these times.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So just
Sorry, if we can also acknowledge that, like, the ways of doing, like, in supporting them, right? Like, it's not just an alternative way. It's a way that has been for a very long time, and then has been offered to us so many times, and we've rebuffed. It would be nice to see us start to acknowledge and shift who we listen to about how we should live our lives as well.
Amen. All right, well, we could talk about this for hours, and I see that through the chat, we are already, a lot of us, on board with continuing this conversation over time. So I look very much forward to the next steps, both in our inquiry and action, and next opportunities to connect with others that have expertise on these topics. I hope that those of you that heard this today or will listen to it later got something out of it. I hope you'll consider engaging with the 2 students that were on the webinar today, as well as their cohort members that are all trying to launch into the field at this time. Here's some ways to stay connected with us. Our information is also probably available through the actual summit materials, but don't ever hesitate to reach out in any way, shape, or form. And thanks for all that everyone is doing in their respective field and efforts at this very concerning time, but a time that potentially gives us the chance to really shift some paradigms and make some changes. So anything else to add from my fellow participants at this time?
Thanks, y'all. It was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Be safe.
Bye.